Hi everyone, today my presentation is about China's foreign policy on Latin America. I'm going to introduce the history of Sino-Latin American relations, then discuss why China and Latin America is more and more intimate. Finally, I will introduce an open question whether China is a good friend or a predator to Latin America. First, let's look at some facts of the history of China-Latin America relations. The first stage is non-governmental exchanges. The 20-year from 1949 to 1969 was basically a period of carrying out non-governmental exchanges. After the founding of New China in 1949, it actively carried out diplomatic work with Latin America and hoped to establish and develop friendly relations with Latin American countries on the basis of equality and mutual benefit. But in a bipolar Cold War, the United States has tried to block any contact between the Latin American countries and new communist China. After the Second World War, Latin American countries followed the United States to maintain diplomatic relations with Taiwan because they were deeply influenced by the US politically, economically, and militarily, and lacked independence in foreign policies. In 1960, immediately after the Cuban Revolution, Cuba established diplomatic ties with China, becoming the first Latin American country to establish diplomatic ties with the People's Republic of China. The origin of the China-Cuba relations began when the Qing dynasty established a consulate in Havana, while Cuba was a still colony of Spain in 1879. In 1902, the Qing recognized the independence of the Republic of Cuba from the United States. Cuba and China are both ruled by a communist party, however, they were on the different sides during the Cold War, with Cuba being an ally of the Soviet Union, while China opposed it since it had different views on communism. The second stage is expansion of diplomatic relations. With the tenet of Sino-American relations in the 1970s, China ushered in the stage of expanding diplomatic ties with Latin America. A number of Latin American countries and the Chinese government began formal contacts and negotiations on the establishment of diplomatic ties. The normalization of diplomatic relations between the two sides was finally realized. From 1970 to 1977 alone, China established diplomatic relations with 11 Latin American countries. This universal establishment of diplomatic ties makes the beginning of the development of China-Latin American relations. The expansion of diplomatic ties between China and Latin American countries is based on the following facts. First, the 20 years since the founding, People's Republic China have been proved to be solid on the basis of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. China has actively developed relations with other developing countries, remain opposed hegemonism and an independent foreign policy. Second, in the 1970s, Sino-US relations began to thaw. China resumed its legitimate seat in the UN and the Security Council, and its international status rose unprecedentedly. Third, Latin American countries have begun to pursue an independent foreign policy. In their exchanges with China, they have come to realize that both Latin America and China are third world countries and share broad common interests. The third stage is common development stage. In 1980s, China and Latin America witnessed frequent high-level exchanges of visits, deepening economic and trade cooperation, and the establishment of diplomatic ties between China and Latin America once again reached a climax. During this period, 6 more Latin American countries established diplomatic ties with China. Latin American country relations was further consolidated and improved. The fourth stage is the appearance of long-term stable relationship. In the 1990s, dramatic changes occurred in the world. The upheavals in Eastern Europe, the collapse to the Soviet Union, and the end of the Cold War. Latin American countries seem to lose their place and directions in the US backyard. At this time, China's reform and opening up has made remarkable achievements. In this international context, China-Latin American relations have entered a new period of time. Latin American countries attach greater importance to developing relations with China. In 1990, Chairman Yang Shangkun, as head of the state, paid a visit to Mexico, Uruguay, and Argentina and Chile. This is the first time after the founding of the PRC, Chinese head of state to visit Latin America. Yang in Mexico put forward four principles. First, based on the five principles, to establish and develop friendly relations and cooperation with all Latin American countries. Second, on the basis of equality, mutual benefit, and exchange of needed goods, draw on each other's strength and depend trade economic cooperation. Third, respect each other's traditions and values and learn from each other. Fourth, in international affairs, the two sides should strengthen mutual support and cooperation. Nowadays, China has become a major economic and political force in Latin America. By 2015, Chinese leader Xi Jinping has made 2 trips to the region in 13 months. At a Beijing meeting of the Community of Latin America and Caribbean State, he pledged about 250 US dollar, 250 billion US dollar in investment to Latin America over the next 10 years. A Chinese company is planning to build a canal in Nicaragua, and the government has announced plans for a space satellite base in Argentina. China is the primary market for Latin American natural resources and the driver for international infrastructure projects. The very significant question is that why China attaches such importance on Latin America. Previously, Chinese scholars and foreign policy analysts were of the opinion that the moral doctrine prevailed in the region. Articulated by US in 1823, the moral doctrine asserted US hegemony over its southern neighbors by telling other powers of the time to stay out. Quite unlike the past, however, in recent years, China's presence in the US backyard has profoundly increased due to a number of factors. Firstly, China's foreign policy has undergone a visible shift from Deng Xiaoping's dictum "lie low and bide your time" to a strategy of power projection and active engagement under President Xi Jinping. Although the region of Latin America is not strategically as important to China as South Asia or East Asia, bonhomie between the two sides has considerably increased in recent years along with China's more active outreach. Second, the ongoing Sino-US power transition and America's close engagement with allies in Asia, as well as new partners such as India and Vietnam, has in a way driven China into Latin America in order to counterbalance the United States. Third, China seeks to fulfill its commercial interests. Latin America possesses wealth of mutual resources, which are crucial to China's brisk economic development. China, for its part, seeks to obtain raw materials and diversify the source of such imports. In fact, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce has identified Latin America, along with the Middle East, Africa, and Russia Central Asia as 3 chief areas that are likely to become net energy suppliers for Beijing. Beijing also wants to sustain its success to overseas markets in order to secure the export of Chinese manufactured products. Bilateral trade between China and Latin America stood at $263 billion in 2014. Fourth, China has significant geopolitical interests in the region. The white paper on Latin America and the Caribbean, published in 2008, clearly states that the One China principle is the political basis for the establishment and development of relations between China and Latin America. Currently, of Taiwan's 22 diplomatic allies, 12 are found in Latin America and the Caribbean, more than in any other region. Finally, China adheres to the principle of multipolarity and the idea of multilateralism. To accomplish this objective, Beijing requires a network of allies from the global south, including Latin American nations. In order to show off the country's bonhomie with the region, China has used the Global South or Developing Countries card. China claims that the country shares a common history with most developing nations, resulting in better understanding and shared demands and desires. Also, reinforcing solidarity on these grounds denotes that China combines patriotism with Marxist internationalism in its foreign policy. Apart from bilateral commercial and political engagement, Beijing also engages with Latin American countries in various multilateral platforms, such as the China Community of Latin American and Caribbean States Forum, for short CELAC, United Nations, Organization of American States, G5 Group, and BRICS Group, and the BASIC Group. Further, the number of high-level bilateral visits evidently indicates that the importance which Latin America enjoys in China's foreign policy agenda. Between 2000 and 2015, Chinese premiers and presidents visited the region as many as 31 times, with Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Cuba figuring as the top destinations. When discussing China's foreign policy on Latin America, it is widely disputed whether China is a partner or a predator to Latin America. For the United States, China's widening presence in Latin America has been much more than a mere nuance in its political backyard. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned on a tour of the region that predatory leading practice and other malign or nefarious behavior by Beijing has injected coercive capital into the economic bloodstream, giving life to corruption and eroding good governance. As Americans see it, Chinese companies are harming Latin America by investing mostly in the extraction and transportation of its precious raw materials. This, they say, has led to greater dependence on commodities as opposed to U.S. companies which focus on manufacturing and services. Many Latin Americans share these concerns, but for others, the difference between the long-standing American influence and the growing Chinese rule is not so black and white. Latin America has for centuries grappled with different forms of foreign influence. The grievances and wounds created by hundreds of years of Spanish and Portuguese rule are today still present in the collective psyche. Despite former foreign control ending more than a century ago, the U.S. then quickly became the hegemonic power, but this strategic control has been hard to sustain over the past 2 decades, partly because of China, whose growing economy has driven up demand for commodities. Trade between China and Latin America has surged from $12 billion in 2000 to almost $306 billion in 2018. and China has become a major investor. A more benign interpretation suggests that China's role in the region has been positive. Chinese demand for Latin America's commodity undeniably has helped drive the economic boom for the past decades that doubled the size of Latin America's middle class and dramatically reduced poverty. Some speculate that China's growing interest in positive, stable returns may lead it to converge on Western models of rule-based investment and development. In the last, I'd like to draw a conclusion for my presentation. The history of China-Latin American relations went through different stages towards closer cooperation. China has many reasons to improve relations with Latin America, including commercial, political, and ideological reasons. The question whether China is a partner or a predator to Latin America has been disputed. The one definite thing is China's influence in Latin America is going to enlarge. This is my references. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me as well as provide a comment on the Moodle. Thank you.